the Prime Minister was referring was that since the conflict started, I think there has been, let's say, a very unwise diplomatic pressure on Ethiopia. Of course, from the point of view of external actors, I think there is every interest that, the conflict doesn't lead to civilian casualties and atrocities, and that has been also, I think, cautiously taken into consideration by the Ethiopian government. But we are talking about a rebel group that ruled the country for 27 years under an ethnic federal system which racialized Ethiopian society, and its socio-economic political power is controlled by very few elites. So when that political change took place in 2018, it was inevitable that the Ethiopian larger public had enough of the Tigray People's Liberation Front. There was no way they could come back to power. So there has to be some finality. The expectation from the peace settlement is that we don't compromise Ethiopian security out of the desire to meet external actors' interests.
So, Professor, another comment the Prime Minister reportedly made is that the TPLF should respect Ethiopia's constitution. What exactly do you think he's talking about?
Well, I think it's very clear. TPLF led a war of insurrection against the federal government, first of all, by attacking the major military base in Tigray, which was protecting the people in the territory of Ethiopia within the administrative region of Tigray. And that led to a very useless, I think, and very devastating conflict for the past 2 years, like I mentioned. And this has compromised Ethiopia's ability to project its territorial integrity and sovereignty. So for me, one of the negotiated outcomes of the negotiation, if there has to be any cessation of hostilities, is that the larger public in Ethiopia expects that the TPLF should disarm. This is a very dangerous group that has to be contained if Ethiopia has any future for peaceful settlement and development.
Thank you so much, Professor, for taking your time to talk with us.
Thank you, James.
Masembet Asefa is the Assistant Professor of Law at the Addis Ababa University School of Law. You are speaking with us from Addis Ababa. More than 70 journalists have been killed this year across the world for fulfilling their role in society. According to the United Nations, most of the crimes go unsolved as many reporters are imprisoned, threatened, and their rights violated. And as the world marks the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, the UN has asked governments and the international community to take the necessary steps to protect journalists. Maureen Ojiambo reports.
The United Nations says a free press is vital to a functioning democracy, exposing wrongdoing, navigating our complex world, and advancing the UN Sustainable Development Goals. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says a surge in disinformation, online bullying, and hate speech, particularly against women journalists, is contributing to the oppression of media workers around the world. Kenya is in the spotlight after the police recently killed a Pakistan journalist in exile, Ashrad Sharif. The police later said it was a case of mistaken identity. The incident has led to mixed reaction, a journalist wanting more investigations on the matter. Victor Bwire is the Director of Media Training and Development at the Media Council of Kenya.
The space for freedom of expression on journal safety has deteriorated globally for various reasons. We are seeing an increase in denial to access to information, an increase on especially online trolling and intimidation, and that is obviously a concern. So the statistics do not look well. While the types and means of how journalists are intimidated and harassed have changed, killings is not a major form of intimidation, but we see increasingly denial to access to information.
The United Nations Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists aims to create a safe and free environment for media workers. The resolution calls on all member states to take tangible steps to combat the culture of impunity in their countries. Bwire says, to some extent, journalists are becoming a threat to themselves by failing to observe the professional code of ethics.
So we see that, obviously, the issue of statement bias, coverage bias, and media bias, which are global, obviously, challenges that we have seen, that sometimes there is a forgetting the line, and people are sometimes overdoing, for example, political bias. And once they fail to adhere to professional ethics, they expose themselves to safety issues, because then they lack objectivity, they lack sticking to the truth.
The president of Kenya Editors Guild, Churchill Oduor, says the recent killings of a Pakistan journalist in Kenya should be a concern for both Kenyan journalists and journalists across the world.
It does raise serious concerns as to safety of journalists in Kenya Kenya, when you consider what's happening elsewhere in Africa, when you consider what's happening in Somalia, in Ethiopia, and many other African states, has been seen as relatively safe for the practice of journalism. But we also know that Kenyan politics every time and again presented risks for the Kenyan journalists.
Irene Khan is the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression. She says that free and independent media are the key pillar of democracy globally.
But the gap between the risks and threats faced by journalists today and what is being done, between the challenges and the actions, there remains an alarmingly wide gap. Media freedom and the safety of journalists are in dangerous decline around the world, with negative consequences on human rights, democracy, public participation, and trust in the integrity of information.
UNESCO says silencing a journalist should not only be a concern of one individual or journalists' unions, but it is also an issue that affects society, its present and future. Reporting for VOA's Daybreak Africa, I am Moreno Giambo in Sacramento, California.
You are listening to Daybreak Africa on the Voice of America. I am James Barty in Washington. Today is Wednesday, the 2nd day of November. For more Africa news and features, visit our website at voaafrica.com. Connect with us on all social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. A U.S. federal judge has sentenced two Democratic Republic of Congo nationals to prison for their roles in the trafficking of wildlife products from the DRC to Seattle. A press release from the U.S. Department of Justice says Herdade Lukua, 34, was sentenced to 20 months in prison, while Jospin Mujangi, 32, was sentenced to 14 months. Both men had pleaded guilty to conspiracy and Lassie Act charges on July 13. The court determined that Lukua was the organizer of a trafficking operation involving more than 5 other conspirators, whose goal was to ship a cargo container full of elephant ivory, white rhinoceros horn, and pangolin scales to Seattle. Mujangi helped package the wildlife products and handled the financial details to process the repayment through a Chinese bank and then back to the DRC. The UN Climate Conference will be held in Egypt on November 6, at a time when the Horn of Africa is seeing record droughts and major emitters are failing to tackle the global challenge. Juma Majanga interviews the UN Environment Program Executive Director Inger Andersen as she prepares to host world leaders in Egypt.
According to a recent report by the UN Environment Program, the international community is still falling far short of the 2015 Paris Agreement goals, with no credible pathway to keep the rise in global temperatures below the key threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Carbon-cutting plans by governments are still inadequate, and environmental leaders are asking developed countries to do more. In an exclusive interview with VOA, UN Environment Executive Director Inger Andersen said, climate change is accelerating, and efforts to tackle it must also be accelerated.
75% of all greenhouse gas emissions are from those 20 G20, the biggest 20 economies. They need to do more. And that is the conversation that we need to have at the COP in Sharm el-Sheikh, Africa's COP as we call it. They need to lean in, both with money, but also with their own emissions reductions.
Africa contributes the least in global emissions, but experts say the continent is the most vulnerable to impacts of climate change. Thandile Chinyavanu is a climate and energy campaigner at Greenpeace Africa in South Africa.
We've seen over the continent, this past year, some devastating impacts in the Horn of Africa, where the fourth failed rainy season is driving famine in the country, and similarly in the semi-arid regions of Kenya. We're seeing people in Mauritania and Nigeria affected by floods, and where those floods have displaced something like 1.3 million people. And we've seen that in South Africa as well.
The 27th session of the Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Egypt provides an opportunity for the international community to continue negotiations for global goals that will tackle climate change. Muhtari Amiku Kano is the Africa Director for Policy and Government Relations at the Nature Conservancy in Nairobi.
As the world gathers in Egypt, the expectation is that it will address the climate crisis, including investing in technological transfer, in capacity building, and in deploying adequate financial resources. Because without these three components, it will just be hot air and talk.
Scientists say fighting climate change requires well-coordinated global action where everyone has a role to play. A lot of promises were made at last year's COP26 conference in Glasgow, and discussions at the Sharm el-Sheikh conference will be followed closely by many. Here again is Inga Anderson.
We are seeing that renewable energy, solar, electric vehicles, energy efficient buildings, smart infrastructure is becoming the thing. Let's accelerate that, right? Let's just move it right ahead. That's so obvious.
Climate change leaders and activists are calling for more ambitious commitments from major emitters with clear roadmap for action. Juma Majanga, VOA Africa News Center, Nairobi, Kenya.
Kenya's museums and partners are conserving and promoting indigenous seeds after the government lifted a ban on genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, for farming. The museum says the native seeds are at risk because of the GMO seeds, which the government and some farmers say will help them to produce more crops faster as the region suffers a historic drought. Victoria Amunga reports from Nairobi.
Tens of exhibitors, a majority of them farmers keen on indigenous crop production, showcased varieties of native seeds at a recent Indigenous Seed and Food Culture Fair at the National Museums of Kenya. Organizers say the fair was set up to promote homegrown seeds amid the growing popularization of genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, for products like maize. Patrick Maundu is a researcher at the museum.
Maize is a staple food in Kenya, and in Kenya we have traditional maize. What you've seen, yellow, indigo, all sorts of colors, black, sometimes blue, you still find it in traditional communities.
On October 3rd, the government lifted a 10-year ban on GMOs. The state hopes to improve crop yields and food security in the wake of a drought that has threatened the nation's food security. Indigenous crop advocates say the move risks the extinction of native seeds in the future as a result of seed types mixing. Anne Maina, the coordinator for Biodiversity and Biosafety Association of Kenya, explains.
When you look at the smallholder farmer in Kenya, they grow in small pieces of land. And especially if you look at maize, there's cross-pollination that happens. Our farmers cannot afford to leave a buffer zone around their farm to avoid cross-pollination.
Consequently, authorities are now encouraging farmers to conserve the native seeds. Samuel Deritu is among at least 200 farmers in the initiative. Deritu is safeguarding more than 500 varieties of native seeds on his farm. He believes the quality of food supersedes the quantity that the GMO foods present.
Food security is just, you have food. You don't know where it's coming from. You don't know how it has been grown. But when you talk of food sovereignty, it's a right for me to grow my quality food, what I want to grow. I save my own seeds, not being told this is the seed that you are going to grow.
Some farmers say they are willing to abandon indigenous seeds for GMO varieties because they believe GMOs mature faster and produce a bigger crop yield even with small land size. One such farmer, Simon Mamai, told VOA he believes in the research behind the technology. He says if GMO is going to improve our produce as intended, as a farmer, I support it because we want a good harvest and in good time. In its declaration this month, Kenya's National Bureau of Standards approved the production of genetically modified maize, cassava, potato, and cotton. At least 7 other countries in Africa have approved commercial production of GMO crops, including Ethiopia, Malawi, Nigeria, and South Africa. Victoria Amunga for VOA News, Nairobi.
Mounds of plastic waste in his hometown prompted one Zimbabwean man to build a shredder that helps turn the trash into useful items. He plans to move the project to the capital Harare, where authorities have been struggling to deal with plastic waste dumped on the streets. Columbus Mavunga reports from Bulawayo.
Troubled by the plastic waste in the streets of his city, Bulawayo, 34-year-old Qinisani Kalindlovu quit his lucrative construction business and is now using his backyard to recycle plastic into items used by school children.
In 5 years' time, Umhlaba Recycling will probably be producing sports equipment, recycled for educational purposes. You're mentioning your kids' counters, you're mentioning your book holders, and we're looking at sitting areas for school children, particularly outdoors.
Ndlovu collects plastics from his neighborhood and from schools near his home in Bulawayo and feeds it into a shredder. From there, the material is melted down and molded into items such as outdoor benches for school children. Ndlovu's efforts are applauded by Adam Sakala, the parent of a Bulawayo student.
This program is so helpful because it keeps the school clean. Yes, and also the school children, since they always throw the booklets around, so by collecting these booklets, it clears all the dirt and the pollution also by the school.
For years now, authorities in Zimbabwe have struggled to dispose of plastic. Nkaniso Ndlovu is the cleansing superintendent of the city of Bulawayo. He says his council is putting in place policies to encourage private companies and volunteers to go into recycling business.
Plastic waste is one of the waste that is giving us serious problems as the city of Bulawayo, because everywhere where you go, you will meet plastic waste. In the streets of the CPD, in the residential areas, all over the place there is plastic waste.
The same is true for Zimbabwe's capital city of Harare, where Qinisani Kalindlovu hopes to move and establish a recycling business there to fight plastic waste.
And that's it for this Wednesday, November 2nd edition of Daybreak Africa. We thank you for coming on board with us this morning. For more Africa news and features, visit our website at voaafrica.com. Connect with us on all social media platforms.